welcome to the Poor Sports Seattle podcast. This is my third time trying to record this. The first time I literally just choked on water. It was very embarrassing. So today I'm going to talk about the Mike Petriello article. Statcast writer and podcaster and occasional alternative broadcaster, Mike Petriello wrote a really interesting article about T-Mobile Park and how it's the most extreme ballpark in baseball, which go check it out. I think it's called, here's what it's called. It's called T-Mobile Park. Oh, MLB's most extreme ballpark isn't in Colorado. We're going to talk in depth about that article. I also want to talk about this idea I have about how the Seahawks can acquire a young quarterback, what it will take, what they will have to accept, what concessions they will have to make, and also, I'm just going to acknowledge this right now. I've had 2 straight clips coming out of episodes about Kirk Cousins coming to Seattle. One thing people seem to have a hard time understanding, and I can look at the metrics, by the way. People are not watching the whole video, and that's maybe that's my fault, maybe that's their fault. The argument is not that Kirk Cousins is better than Geno Smith. All things being equal, I like Geno Smith better. I think he's also better for like the modern NFL because even though he's in his mid-30s, like still has a lot of athleticism left. Which, I mean, we saw Kirk Cousins in 2024. There's nothing left there. Hopefully he'll be better than he was in 2024 in 2025, but there is nothing left as far as like surplus athleticism. He is a well below average athlete for the modern NFL quarterback. But I'm going to talk more about what I think the Seahawks need to do. So the deal with that is the way the Seahawks would acquire Kirk Cousins, in my estimation, if it were to happen, is the Falcons would release him. So it's not Kirk Cousins for Geno Smith. It's Kirk Cousins at a $30 million savings against the cap because the Falcons would be paying Kirk Cousins his guaranteed salary for 2025 for Geno Smith. So Geno Smith or Kirk Cousins plus $30 million to spend on other people seems very simple to me. All right. Let's talk about this Mike Petriello article because it's caused our local media in the Seattle area to start talking about T-Mobile Park and how T-Mobile Park affects batters. And I want to say real quickly, I'm going to just say this because it's true and it's annoying, and I don't think that this podcast is the podcast of record or whatever medium you care about. It's not that of record. But we've been saying this shit for 2 years on this podcast. I have, anyway. I've been arguing with Alex when he was still on the podcast, and a lot of it was in reference to the pitching staff not being historically great. And we're going to talk about that in a moment because we're going to talk about this article. But this stuff I've been talking about it for 2 years. I had a blog for 10 years that I wrote about it on. And I'm not the only one. There's a lot of people writing about this, about how difficult T-Mobile Park is. At the time, we called it Safeco Field because that was a significantly better name. But even though, it's like an insurance company sponsor versus a cell phone company sponsor. But my point is this is not new information. This is just like, it took this landmark article, and I will say this. When Mike Petriello said this article, the stuff he uncovered in his investigation, that definitely makes it sound more like cloak and dagger than it actually is. He just, in his analysis, that's a better way to phrase it, is really insightful. It's really cool. You should go check it out. Even after you listen to this and even after you listen to local sports radio, which I've been listening to a lot of local sports radio, by the way, because my kids they keep repeating stuff they hear on comedy podcasts. So, yeah, I guess like my frustration is that it's the Mariners have not had their feet held to this fire, even though it's literally like Edgar Martinez, Alex Rodriguez, Brett Boone, Teoscar Hernandez says it at the All-Star game, and now we all start paying attention. Like, people have been frustrated with this ballpark and how hard it is to hit there for a long time. And the one thing I will say, reading this article by Mike Petriello, one thing that I will say, I'm going to say a lot of things, but one of the things that I will say is it's multifactorial. It's not fix the batter's eye and that solves it. It's not bring the fences in and that solves it. It's not close the roof and that solves it. It's not change the the start time, and that solves it. It's none of those things, because there's so many things that could potentially be impacting it, and it seems like in T-Mobile Park, it's all those things. It's the glare of the sun. It's the wind, and he talks very interestingly about the wind that's between the pitcher and the batter. Very interesting stuff. That one, I don't even know how I would have found the measurements, but I would have never like blamed it on that. Nor do I think it's like so obvious that wind is what makes a right-hander's breaking ball better or something like that. It's not, none of those things are the only thing. Now, to me, if you're the Mariners, and maybe they've been doing this, but I don't think so, because I think we would have heard about it. If you're the Mariners and you want to make the argument that you're better off spending $30 million renovating the stadium so that your team can actually hit and your team can actually attract a free agent because it's not where hitters go to die, I could argue that's a better way to spend $30 million than on Alex Bregman annually or on Pete Alonso annually. Sure. I don't think they're doing either. Yeah, so some interesting stuff in this article, and I've talked about it ad nauseum at different points, but we're going to dig pretty far into it because, Mike Petriello made cool what I've been talking about for years. Also, by the way, I haven't listened in many years, but Mike Petriello, if it's still going on, his Statcast podcast was like really informative, very good. I have kids now. I have to lean out my podcast diet, and unfortunately, that's been one of the things that has been leaned out of my my podcast diet. But basically, so T-Mobile Park suppresses offense by 11%. Coors Field increases offense by 10%. And in either case, they are by far the most extreme on their end of the spectrum. But the ways that T-Mobile Park suppresses offense can be potentially surprising because, and I hope maybe everyone knows this already. Petriello talks about this in here. I think a pretty good way. It's not perfect. I can see flaws in it. It leaves a margin of error, no doubt. But a pretty good way to analyze the effect of the ballpark is how does a team perform on the road, which is in an aggregate of all the road stadiums versus at home. And then compare that to the rest of the league, right? So their rank among the league. We did this a lot last year, talking about whether or not this pitching staff was historic, how much of it had to do with the ballpark. And what's very interesting is people love to talk about the ballpark when it relates to the Mariners offense, but they don't make the same subtractions when they're talking about the Mariners pitching staff. I will say the pitching staff was healthy all year. That was remarkable. Essentially healthy all year. There were certainly a Brian Wu shaped exception to that, but they were very healthy and they're very young and they're pretty good strikeout pitchers. But at home, they were the best by I want to say a full percentage. I actually have it up. Hold on. By 1.5%. So their strikeout rate at home, their pitching staff's strikeout rate at home, 27.2%. Second place, San Diego Padres at home, 25.7%. They also play in a pretty good pitcher's ballpark. On the road, the Mariners are tied for the 20th best strikeout rate, 21.6%. A full 5% behind the Atlanta Braves. The Atlanta Braves, by the way, on the road, 25.4%. At home, 26.6%. Do you expect a team to be better on the road than at home? Better at home than on the road. I do think you do, because I think you probably get a couple benefit of the doubt calls. There's a great Twitter account called Ump Scorecards, and it looks at where are umpires affecting the expected run value with missed balls and strike calls. I would bet if you looked at that, and I have not, and I could be wrong, but my bet is there's a slight bias towards the home team. Also, you don't have to travel, and you're familiar with the mound, and you're familiar with the locker room, and you got to see your wife that day, whether that's good or bad for the player. Like, there's a lot of things that are different about being at your home ballpark that I could see leading to a small variation. But we don't see that really with other teams. San Diego, by the way, at home. Where are you, San Diego? San Diego just not on here? Am I crazy? What's going on here? Hold on. Oh, yeah, Jesus, they're there. They are ranked 15th. So another, wow, that was embarrassing. That was like, you need reading glasses, except you're already wearing glasses level of embarrassing. So they're ranked 15th. So they have a huge drop. Also, another team that pitches in a deceivingly good pitcher's ballpark. Deceiving meaning it deceives you into thinking the pitching staff is a lot better than it is. So that's kind of the argument also, by the way, for like, is Luis Castillo actually so great? Is Logan Gilbert actually so great? And could you replace those guys with something like a league average starter and get the same results? And I think the answer is possibly yes, because the ballpark has such an effect. But again, this is like, another thing I will say about this is, I don't want to play amateur psychologist almost ever. I have no qualifications. What I will occasionally do, I'm never going to tell you that I think this does this, unless there's data to back it up. Data to back up that that's a causal element, right? And what I will say is an anecdotal thing from Teoscar Hernandez, many frustrated batters in this ballpark, from Adrian Beltre, the only guy who has really not had a drop-off of significance when he came to Seattle, from my estimation, and this could be slightly wrong, is Nelson Cruz. And Nelson Cruz had two things going for him. He was taking steroids earlier in his career, and he has light tower power. He has power that cannot be contained by Safeco Field at the time. So, I mean, Nelson Cruz was, through his stretch in Seattle, let's take a look at Nelson Cruz. I think one of the all-time great hitting Mariners in his stretch. I mean, let's see. You're talking like WRC pluses of 158, 148, 146, 133. And then, yeah. His career comes to, like, as you might expect, as a guy is 40 and older, he slowed down at the end of his career. But his time in Seattle, he was an elite hitter. He was a 5-win DH in 2015. That's really hard to do. But he is such a special exception. And also at the time, agents and players and other teams did not know so much about how much T-Mobile Park suppresses offense. They just didn't know that much about it. So Nelson Cruz, if he became a free agent in 2025 instead of 2015, leading into the 2015 season, probably is not going to sign with the Mariners. I can't remember what his market was like, but I remember he was rumored to Seattle. Well, no, did he get traded? No, he did not get traded. I was thinking of that same offseason the Mariners traded Michael Saunders. The Mariners traded, I made one of the worst article headlines I've ever made in my life, or articles, period. I used to have a blog called North and South of Royal Brome. And when they when they signed Nelson Cruz, traded Michael Saunders for J.A. Happ, my argument was that they traded Saunders for a bad pitcher, and Saunders would be as good as Nelson Cruz for the rest of his career. And it did not, believe it or not. I don't know how many of you remember Michael Saunders. I was pulling up, I wonder if that was for the previous attempts to record. I definitely was. I was pulling up Charles. We're going to talk about the Rockies in a moment, because I think this is a good the way the Rockies are, it's a good way to think of Mariners pitchers. The way people play in Colorado when they go there as decent hitters, the way they have a career boost is a good way to think about what the Mariners can do with their pitching staff. So, who was that? Michael Saunders. We'll see what he did. I can't remember exactly what his career. I mean, it wasn't great in Toronto. I think he had a couple decent stretches, but so 2015, he must have been injured. Plays 9 games, 36 plate appearances, 0.0 wins above replacement. 2016, 558 plate appearances, 24 home runs, 2.3 wins above replacement, 119 WRC plus. The following year, 2017, must have been injured and ineffective. Ends up playing only 73 games with 2 teams, one of them being Philadelphia. I imagine that trade had to have happened either pretty early or when he was maybe he had been optioned to the minors, and that ends up being the end of his career. Cruz, by the way, who was old at the time, that was one of my arguments, is he's 34 and is not athletic. He ends up playing until 2023. Saunders, the young, athletic, defensive value adding outfielder, is done at age 30. The trade was made going into his age 28 season, and he's done at age 30. So done in 2017, 6 years before Nelson Cruz's career ended. That was a bad one on my part. I'll take blame on that. Nelson Cruz is an exception and a guy that I don't think you could sign in 2025. Certainly not with the budget the Mariners have, but yeah. So the way that I would think about, if you're not like super familiar with park factors and you just want like an anecdote, you want like stories that you can equate with what's going on with the Mariners pitchers, is, do you remember the early days of the Rockies? And if you don't, I understand. You might not be old enough. You might not care enough. You might not be a nerd. The Rockies had these guys. They had, let's see what Charles Johnson did real quick. Charles Johnson was a glove first catcher that was always interesting, like a super, like uber prospect. Colorado, he had like a bump compared to previous years, but was not that great offensively in Colorado. By the way, not that great offensively is still a guy with like a 200 plus isolated power because Colorado's so crazy. So his 236, 350, 430, 230, 320, 455. I mean, this dude he was hitting for power in that ballpark because that ballpark encourages power numbers. The Rockies had in their early days Vinny Castillo and Andres Galarraga, Dante Bichette, certainly other guys, Larry Walker. And Larry Walker was a great player who was then heavily propped up by Coors Field. But he was a guy who, my memory at least, is that he was very good in Montreal before he ended up in Colorado. And let's see. Yeah, his Montreal numbers, he's like 149, 120, 142, 129 WRC plus. Larry Walker was raking, and then it went to Colorado and raked even more and became one of baseball's best hitters by production, by just raw production. Became a Hall of Famer in Colorado. Maybe would have been on that trajectory anyway, but maybe not. We don't know at what point his career would have maybe started to decline a little bit faster. So that's what's going on with the Mariners pitchers. It's easier for the Mariners pitchers to strike out batters. What are the reasons? The wind between home plate and the mound is interesting. The thing that Mike Petriello said, and I'm like blending these last 2 attempts to record this because I'm not certain I've even referenced the fact. He tweeted that he had found something out. He couldn't confirm it before the story, but he has since confirmed it. And it's that based on Seattle's position on the earth and the way that gravitational pull works, Seattle has additional gravity that like Miami doesn't have. And the estimates are that the additional gravitational pull makes a home run in Seattle, travel 1 foot less far than in Miami. Is that 1 foot the biggest thing? No, of course not. But when you start compounding all these little things, the fences were deep, the wind blowing in, by the way, like there's wind coming into the stadium, there's the batter's eye, there's so many things that compound to create this environment that's just very bad to hit in. And I said this earlier in the offseason. If you're a free agent hitter and you want a platform year, you are never going to come to Seattle. This is why the Mariners have to go. Now, this is also why, by the way, they might be smart. And I hate to give them credit, but they might be smart to trade away none of these guys, these prospects, these offensive prospects. Because if you clear that deck, those might be the last offensive players you could acquire in the big leagues for a long time. It might be the next offensive player you could acquire has not yet been drafted by the Mariners if you clear that deck. Is Randy Arozarena going to want to continue to play here after his? I mean, you better pay him if he's going to. He's got to be pissed. There's a lot of, there were some stories throughout the season and in the offseason about him being a little bit of a malcontent. If I'm a batter that's approaching free agency, I am pissed if I get traded. This stadium might be costing a Randy Arozarena millions of dollars a year. If I'm a batter, I don't want to come here. And especially right now. And if the Mariners do make changes to the ballpark, they better be out in front celebrating those changes. Because, yes, of course, over time, the market will see that T-Mobile Park is not this black hole of offense anymore. But that'll take a lot of time. It took this long for the local media, who's in Seattle, we've had some of the leaders, some of the people at the absolute leading edge of sabermetric research living here, writing about the Mariners in particular. And it took that long for the mainstream media to realize that the ballpark is having a huge effect on this offensive production. So yeah, I hope the Mariners invest in making the stadium a little more hospitable for hitters. I don't think that, just bringing the fences in is going to solve it. I mean, the batter's eye to me feels like you got to do that. That's like the absolute minimum. Can you do something to reduce the glare? Can you move games back to starting at 7:00 or whatever? I've got mixed feelings about that. If my preference would be, can you make it so that the 6:40 start or the 4:00 start or whatever doesn't completely blind every player? Can we do something to keep the sun out of these guys' eyes? And does it mean that the roof has to be on all the time? I hope not, because baseball's meant to be played outside, and Seattle summer is beautiful. So, and I also think a lot of people agree with me. Some of the players don't. A lot of people agree that stadium needs to be open. I saw in Petriello's article, he talks about the stadium was closed, I think, 16% of the time last year. And that's more than in, if you go far enough in the past, but not that much more compared to the recent past. Anyway, I mean, one thing about all this is, and this is completely anecdotal. I don't have actual evidence of this except for just living in the Northwest my whole life. It does seem like there's more sun in the summer than there used to be. You could call it climate change, whatever you want. I'm not trying to spark that debate, but it does feel like summers are sunnier than I remember. Do people agree with that? I don't know. And they've been beautiful. I've loved them, but whatever. All right, let's talk about the Seahawks. Let's talk about the Seahawks quarterback situation, because it's going to be the topic of conversation the whole offseason. Geno Smith is, I think, I understand why people think Geno deserves a shot at this starting job again, another crack at making the playoffs. He did lead the team to be 10-7, and there were moments, by the way, I fully get. You sit and watch Geno Smith throw a football, and this is on just arm talent, you're like, this guy should be an absolutely elite quarterback. You watch it, and we saw it in the San Francisco game, we saw I don't know if you know, I don't know if you remember a couple years ago, or a year ago maybe, there was like from practice, the running speeds in miles per hour, and Geno Smith was like at or near the top. Like, he still has a gear that's like a very. I would be interested to see if Geno Smith remains the quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks in a lame duck year, if they don't use him a little bit more on like designed runs, designed bootlegs out. Like, I feel like the Seahawks don't get very much out of Geno Smith's legs. And maybe that's because it's similar to, do you remember when Seneca Wallace was the backup quarterback for Seattle? And they were like, people would be like, you got to get him in for some packages, run some trick plays. And the reason that I always heard that they didn't was because if he gets hurt playing receiver and then Matt Hasselbeck gets hurt, then you're fucked. Then you have no quarterback available. And yeah, I'm here's what I am. This is what I want. Draft a quarterback every year. I would love to see the Seahawks save money on Geno Smith, whether that's signing him to a 1-year extension that makes his 2022 is a time warped 3 years backwards. Is 2025 cap number quite a bit lower? What I do think that the Kirk Cousins thing would be compelling to me. Where you could save $30 million, get yourself completely out of cap hell before you've made a decision on DK Metcalf, before you've released Tyler Lockett, almost certainly, before you've released Draymond Jones, almost certainly, before you've had to make a decision on Noah Fant, before you've had to make a decision on Uchenna Nwosu, before you've had to make a decision on Ray Robertson Harris. Like, before you've had to make these tough decisions, before you've had to extend Ernest Jones or I guess sign Ernest Jones to a new contract, that would be a big win. If you believe that Kirk Cousins is close to Geno Smith. But there's another option, obviously. The Seahawks have, I want to say it's 9 draft picks, and it's a little bit of a misconception that the draft is 7 rounds long, because they also give out a bunch of compensatory picks, and it ends up being like 8 rounds long. It's essentially an 8-round draft, but that's because they add a bunch of compensatory picks to the 3rd through 7th round. So I think it's like another full round. So an average team has 8 picks. The Seahawks have 9. They're distributed pretty evenly throughout the draft. I want to say in the mid rounds, they have one round where they have an extra pick. They got some compensatory picks. I think they had 6 picks and got 3 compensatory picks. So they actually should have been below average, but because of the signings of last year, blah, 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 blah. Nobody cares about this, but there's probably not going to be a first round graded quarterback available when the Seahawks pick. The Seahawks pick 18th. They don't have the draft capital to move up to 1st or 2nd or 3rd or whatever it would take to get Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward. If you believe in either of those guys, and I have my doubts about both those guys, especially if you're going to devote a first-round pick that high to drafting them. And then it comes down to, what is your internal evaluation on the next batch of guys? And I think it's time to prepare for this. The second batch of quarterbacks is deep, if not elite, right? Like, there's the guys that are going to be drafted. There's probably going to be, it's really uncommon for quarterbacks to get congregated in like those 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds. Most often, in my experience watching the draft and analyzing the draft, more quarterbacks than you expect may go in the 1st round, and then the guys that don't go in the 1st or 2nd round, a lot of times those guys fall way back. When a quarterback starts to drop, it feels like they usually drop significantly further than you'd expect. Malik Willis a couple years ago, Aaron Rodgers, I think Drew Brees in his draft year was expected to be like in the 1st round and ends up not being in the 1st round. There was height concerns with Drew Brees, whatever. But another thing that happens we saw this last year is at the beginning of the draft process, J.J. McCarthy was a third-round pick, and Michael Penix was a third-round pick, and Bo Nix was a fourth-round pick in a lot of people's minds. And it's obvious that the quarterback position is incredibly valuable and incredibly important, arguably the most important position in sports. And those guys moved up the draft board. Now, I mean, I think Penix did a lot to curb any doubts that people had about him. He ran very fast compared to what people... And by the way, if you were a Huskies fan, you knew that Penix had some wheels on him. There was no surprise to me that he ran a 4.5 40. And then he made it rain when he was in the throwing drills. It was beautiful. The guy has a world-class arm. He crushed the draft process. J.J. McCarthy crushed the draft process. Bo Nix, I think, crushed the draft process. But also, they benefited from the fact that a lot of teams needed quarterbacks. And if you don't have a quarterback, you have to be trying to find your next quarterback. And last year's draft was, I think, considered a little bit stronger than average, but not incredibly strong. But the place that it was strong was at the quarterback position. I don't think everybody had obviously, I said it earlier. Not everyone had a first-round grade on Michael Penix. Not everyone had a first-round grade on all the quarterbacks that went in the top 12 of the draft. 6 quarterbacks in the top 12 picks. But they moved up during the process because it became obvious that some of these teams were willing to overdraft at the expense of missing out. Bo Nix was not going to make it to the second round. Michael Penix was not going to make it to the second round. I mean, McCarthy was getting talked about at like the 3rd overall pick or the 4th overall pick. They were talking about 1, 2, 3, 4 being quarterbacks. So there's a bunch of quarterbacks that you're probably hearing about if you care about the draft at all. And in your mind, you're probably doing some calculations like the Seahawks have, I think, the 50th pick. Maybe they can get this guy at the 50th pick. Here's what I'm going to bet. It's going to be a lot harder to acquire a quarterback than you expect. If Jackson Dart's like the trendy name right now. Another one is Quinn Ewers is a little less trendy. Jalen Milroe is in that mix. There's a chance all 3 of those guys are gone before the Seahawks draft in the second round. By the way, there's a chance one of those guys goes undrafted. But my point is while there may not be top of the first round talent at quarterback, arguably period in this draft, but certainly after those first 2 guys, that doesn't mean that there's not. My bet is there's going to be 3 first round quarterbacks in this year's draft. And my bet would be that if the Seahawks take a quarterback at 50, it's the 5th quarterback that's taken in the draft. And especially because, by the way, this is considered a very weak draft, meaning that after like the top, I've heard people say as few as 9 players. After that, everybody's grades are second round or worse. Well, if you're a team that's going to be taking a second round grade player and a guy that you've graded as a second round talent. The other thing, I guess one last thing about the quality of this draft, a lot of people have talked about how it's not great at the top, but it's deep. And I think that's actually the inverse of last year. I think last year's draft, very good at the top, not as deep. This year, there's like talent all the way through the 4th and 5th rounds. That's like maybe great. Like there might be 9 players with a first round grade, but there might be 200 players with a 4th round or better grade, which is not me doing these grades, but this is like an interpretation of what quote unquote experts are saying. So if you're a team that has a second round grade on a guy and you're going to have to take a second round grade on a quarterback, and you have to take a player that has a second round grade on your board anyway, why not make that guy a quarterback? The only reluctance I would have is because there's so much pressure placed on first round quarterbacks. If Byron Murphy is a bust, John Schneider probably keeps his job. If CJ Stroud, if the Seahawks drafted CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson, I mean, Anthony Richardson's a great example because I think the team probably would have drafted Anthony Richardson if he was available when they drafted Devin Witherspoon. And if they had, and he was performing the way he has in Indianapolis and as injured as he is and as he's, lost the locker room, it seems like, and he's kind of embarrassed the franchise with some of the stuff he's done, I think it would have been John Schneider and not Pete Carroll potentially that lost his job. There's a lot of pressure placed on drafting a quarterback. I do think there's a market inefficiency, by the way, in not placing that pressure. In draft a quarterback in the first round, be okay with drafting another quarterback in the first round a couple years later. Cut your losses quickly. Don't view the first round. Once this guy becomes a first-round quarterback, he has to be the quarterback of the future. Guys fail at other positions all the time. It's not nearly the fanfare and catastrophizing event as a quarterback in the first round. And stop pampering these quarterbacks in this way. I hate that the Seahawks drafted Russell Wilson, found a good quarterback, didn't touch another quarterback in a meaningful round the rest of the time he was in Seattle. I hated that at the time. I hate it now. It's obviously, thank God Geno Smith was on the roster and better than anybody expected him to be. But yeah, I would have much rather seen the Seahawks draft 4 or 5 quarterbacks in that time. So what I'll say is, while I think it's possible all 5 quarterbacks are gone by the time, all 5 of the top quarterbacks, my estimation right now is those 3 guys I said. But I think it sounds like Ewers, nobody's as impressed with Quinn Ewers as I am, it seems, which isn't to say that I think he's so incredible, but every scouting report talks about the negatives because he came out with such prospect hype and pedigree, and he didn't live up to it, although he played some great games at the end of the season for Texas. I think people are being a little bit hard on him. It's like he's like a band that has like industry backing, and everyone wants to be too cool to like Nickelback in this case. Quinn Ewers is like the Nickelback of the NFL. And maybe he'll go in the second round, maybe he won't, but I would bet 5. My bet, I'd like to do a live stream on the draft day. We'll see. I have it blocked out on my calendar. We'll see. I'd like to at least be available to comment on the draft that day. But if a great comedy show comes along, I'm probably going to do that, frankly. But I would say even be open your mind to the Seahawks drafting a quarterback in the first round that is an enormous reach. And people will absolutely lambaste the pick. Lambast. They will criticize. They will criticize the pick, and it will be they'll get a bad grade on your favorite sports website. And yeah, the same as they did with Russell Wilson. Like, I don't think John Schneider gives a shit about any of that. What I would say is, if you're going to grab a second-round grade player in the first round, that guy better goddamn well be a quarterback, is my opinion. Because if you're wasting that reach on a position that matters a lot less, where there's maybe a little bit more depth, I would much rather see Jackson Dart at 18 than a second-round grade edge rusher or whatever. All right. Casey McLean Comedy, wherever you wherever you do social media outside of X, where I am the Casey McLean. Come see me do stand-up comedy. By the way, I have some clips going wild on Facebook right now. If you're over there, go check those out, Casey McLean Comedy. And I think I'm going to post, I decided this today, my friend Sarah Colonna is coming to Enumclaw. She's a great comic, and she also happens to be married to John Ryan. And I did some shows with them where John hosted, I featured, and Sarah headlined. And I roasted John after every show, or after every set of his. And I think I'm going to post those videos on the Poor Sports YouTube account. So keep an eye out for those. They're very short, but they're funny. Thank you all for listening, and have a good weekend. I don't think I'll do another one the rest of the week. Bye.